good morning, and welcome to the Africa Weekly Talk. Today's subject on the docket is a question, and the question is, what role, if any, that great, selfless, and genuine African leaders in this modern day can play to bring about key fundamental changes to Africa's political systems? I'm talking about these dictatorships, corrupt governments that have become part of the African governance on the continent of Africa. And this has to do with a speech given by the president of Eritrea, ISAIAS AFERWERKI, at the African Climate Summit in Kenya about a month ago. So first, fellas, let's go ahead and listen to the president of Eritrea, and then I'll come back and dissect his argument on the issue of climate change in Africa, as well as the level of corruption and what role all those things have played on the continent of Africa. So let's go ahead and hear the president of Eritrea.
Okay, now let's be focused. Occasions like this one, summits where people come, do their promotion about their achievements, and mostly PR exercise. Let's get out of this cycle, first and foremost, okay? I would like to focus on my own issue. Now people are talking about the resources of the continent, 60% of this endowment, 20% of this endowment. Why can't you mobilize your own resources rather than extend your hands for handouts and charity? Is there a way of mobilizing these resources in the continent? How do you mobilize these resources? Can you mobilize the resources of Niger that are going to Europe, uranium and what have you? What about the mineral resources of this continent? Are you mobilizing these resources for the development of the continent, for climate change? Where are these resources? Everybody is talking about their achievements in their own locality, in their own national borders, without even addressing the real issues challenging this continent. Talk about the continent's challenge and try to find solutions for this challenge, okay? We're talking about climate change, we're talking about resources, you are talking about so many things. Don't divert focus on non-issues, okay? Now, do your homework, come up with a definition of your goals and objectives, strategize, go for detailed plans, and then come to mobilize resources so that you implement your programs. Otherwise, I don't want to waste your time and waste my time talking about our achievements in Eritrea. Try to talk about some of the issues mentioned on this summit. These billions coming to this continent from anywhere, Europe, Americas, or any other place, you are inviting intervention in your own affairs. And this money coming from there, billions and billions, will be siphoned back there. Make sure that you mobilize your own resources so that you can be enabled to benefit from resources coming from outside. The promises of billions is not good. Yeah. Again, it's the focus that we need to talk about. We're talking about corrupt governments and comparing them with the private sector and promoting the private sector, the private sector, the private sector. You put in place accountable government, non-corrupt government that will use national resources for the development of the majority. This is not a matter of polarizing the private sector and the public sector. These classical arguments about the private sector, the public sector, not make sense at all. It's out of context. We need to be focused on this matter. We can't blame governments and bring non-governmental organizations to manage our affairs. That is phenomenal in Africa. Go everywhere. Non-governmental governments, non-governmental organizations are managing government and discrediting governments and replacing them with what they call private sector. Can you imagine this makes sense to anyone? Now talk about serious things, okay? You want to implement programs, articulate your goals and objectives in the first place, okay? Strategize on how you can achieve these goals and objectives. Then go for detailed plans, sectoral plans or industrial plans, and then mobilize resource for that. Give these plans and the resources to reliable hands, accountable hands. Government or private sector doesn't matter. It's not a matter of being with or against that party. How do you mobilize these resources to implement programs so that you address climate change?
Thank you.
Yes, focus. Don't get us to some classical discussions about what the private sector can do, what the public sector can do. Corrupt governments will not implement any program.
All right, fellows. You heard the president of Eritrea, ISAIAS AFERWERKI, at the press conference at the African Climate Summit that took place about a month ago in Kenya. And he made very solid points. Some of these points I've been talking about on this podcast for some time now, with regards to the issue of corruption that have been part of the African government systems and how that has also hindered the socioeconomic development of the African continent. And this scolding of his fellow African leaders at this summit also reminded me of the scolding that Giorgio Meloni of Italy gave the president of France, Macron, a year ago or so, with regards to the issue of France's role in Africa and how it has also contributed to the level of poverty on the continent of Africa. But Mr. President ISAIAS AFERWERKI made some very solid points where he talked about corrupt governments will never implement any program to benefit its citizens. A corrupt government is a corrupt government. I mean, he just looked in the eyes of his fellow peers and told them that if you are corrupt, you will never and never do anything to benefit your fellow citizens of your various African countries. And that is a fact. And he also talked about moving governments into the private sector and calling them private sector. More or less talking about oligarchy system, where some of these corrupt governments use the wealth of the country and channels to their crony capitalist business friends as well as family businesses. And then they're talking about using the private sector to develop their countries. And that is exactly what the point he was making. The oligarchy system that have become part of the African economic system. So I really applaud the president of Eritrea for standing up to his fellow presidents at this summit and telling them as it's supposed to be told. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He told them in their faces that if you are corrupt, you are corrupt. And the part of the problem is that you go out there asking for handouts from former colonial masters and donors. And as far as you do that, what you're also doing is asking for intervention in your internal affairs. So basically, you are being controlled by these foreign donors as far as former colonial masters. And that's a very solid point this man made. And we're talking about a president of a country now spilling the beans out to all of Africans that this is how some of your governments operate. So if you go out there asking for handouts, begging for aid from your former colonial masters as well as donors, then you're also inviting them into your internal affairs. So basically, they are dictating your policies in your various African countries. So you are more like puppets. And that's the point he was making. And this is the point I made about 2 weeks ago with regards to UN General Assembly session that took place in New York, where you heard all these African presidents talking about their grievances with the West and so on and so forth. And then he comes out and tells them that, hold on, fellas, we cannot be going to these people and begging for aid all the time. We have resources in our own countries. Why don't we mobilize our own resources, find this focus, and find a solution to the climate problems going on in our various African countries? Why can't we mobilize our own resources? He even made reference to look at the natural resources that are leaving Niger to other parts of the world, specifically France. When these resources can be used and mobilized in these African countries to help develop these countries. So he made a very solid point. And I really agreed with him on that point. I mean, because at the end of the day, like I stated in some of my other segments with regards to the problems facing Africa's socioeconomic development, a lot of our problems has to do with bad governance. And this over-reliance on former colonial masters as well as donors and aids and all those things coming from World Bank, IMF, and all this stuff. Because at the end of the day, we are not living within our own means. We are not utilizing the resources that we have in our various African countries to use it to develop our countries. And because we want to live outside of our means, we ended up going into borrowing, creating this huge debt. That also hinders what? Economic growth. Because as much as you keep piling on debt and debt and debt onto a country, at the end of the day, what it does is you have to find ways and means to pay these debts. Either by raising taxes on your fellow citizens, creating hardships for your fellow citizens, and that hinders growth. I mean, if you look at most of these African countries today, Africans pay some of the highest taxes in the world. African countries pay some of the highest taxes in the world, but in return, get nothing for it. Poor infrastructures, poor roads, no electricity, no water. But meanwhile, their citizens pay the highest tax in the world. And you hear this argument from their so-called scholars talking about because they don't have a structured system of getting taxes from their citizens, they have to impose this high, import duties, which also affects the livelihood of all their citizens in their various African countries. That's why you go to third world countries in Africa. Look at them. Go there and experience it yourselves. Go to your countries and look at it yourselves. I mean, look at how much it costs, the living expenses in third world countries. How much it costs to buy gasoline. How much it costs to buy food, imported goods in your various African countries. Compare them to Europe or compare them to America here. I mean, a developed country like America, it's even cheaper to buy food than to buy them in most African countries. You know, I mean, and all this has to do with what? Because of the policies of these governments down there. I mean, you paying higher taxes, higher import duties. So at the end of the day, it's the fellow citizens that basically all these higher taxes and import duties that are imposed on the goods and services that are imported into your country are imposed on these poor citizens of these various African countries. So they end up spending a lot of money on basic human amenities. You know, and that is exactly the point this man was making. I mean, you get all this money from these donors. By the end of the day, this money turns around, goes back to these donors. I mean, this is what has been going on for so many years. I mean, this is nothing new. I mean, you get this aid, you get the aid in so many forms, as if like it's coming to you to help you. But at the end of the day, most of this money doesn't stay here. It goes to benefit these very, very countries that are giving you the aid. And most of the loans that they give you also goes to benefit them. So at the end of the day, this is used to develop their economic systems. And we've been doing this for how many years? And we keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, just to justify the term insanity. When you keep doing something over and over and over again, that becomes insanity. You know, and I'm very glad that you have a president of a country, an African country, standing up to his fellow peers and telling them as it is that a corrupt government will never do anything to help develop his or her country, period. Because if you are corrupt, you are corrupt. Because they create these oligarchy systems. So they create these systems where they sell government companies, former government agencies, to their private oligarchy and family businesses and claim it's privatization. And that is the point he was making. And this is coming from fellow African leader, because he knows more than us. He knows what is going on in most of these various African countries. He knows what he's talking about. And that is what has been going on for how many years now? For about 30 years now. Look at your various African countries. Look at most of the former government-owned companies that are now owned by who? Politicians and the presidents and their crony capitalist friends and their family businesses. They own former government-owned companies. And most of these people even didn't put a dime for these companies. Most of these companies pretty much were given to these people without putting a dime on it at the expense of the citizens of their various African countries. And this is the point he was making, where they talk about transition from government to private sector and private sector to government and so on and so forth in the name of privatization. But they use this oligarchy system where they channel these companies to their private crony capitalist friends and family businesses and so on and so forth. And at the end of the day, you don't understand why you are still poor and you continue to be poor because of these selfish leaders, corrupt leaders in your various African countries. And now you have a president of a country standing right there telling you guys and the world that this is the problem that you have in Africa. I mean, how much more do we want to hear? I mean, this is a president from an African country telling us exactly what some of these problems that we face in our various African countries are. You know, I mean, and he made it clear, a corrupt government will never do anything to benefit its citizens, because their goal is to enrich themselves and their crony capitalist friends and family business and so on and so forth. It is sad. It is very, very sad, especially to hear this from a president of an African country. And I'm very happy this man stood up and said it like it's supposed to be said. I mean, I applaud him for that. I really applaud. He's really getting my respect for that. You know, because at the end of the day, you look at the very institutions in Africa, like the AU. This very institution, AU, is supposed to be an institution that basically is supposed to be like a checks and balances on some of these African countries. But the AU itself is corrupt anyway. So at the end of the day, they turn a blind eye to most of these corrupt, undemocratic governments. They turn a blind eye to them because AU is the one who's supposed to be making this case against African leaders. But they wouldn't. Why would they? Because at the end of the day, the AU itself is corrupt. So the whole system, it's unfortunate, but that's the reality. Because when you have a president of a continent scolding his own fellow peers about the level of corruption and the kind of economic systems they have in their various African countries, then what else? What else do we have to hear? I mean, that is what is going on, fellas. It's unfortunate, but that's the reality. And the only way we can change these things is you fellow citizens or these various African countries have to stand up to your governments. That is the only way. I mean, other than that, it's always going to be like this. Nothing is going to change. It's always going to be like this. It's going to be like, it's like a cycle. It's going to be like a cycle. Because you have these corrupt governments who are the helm, who use these Western donors, and they use these Western donors to finance them. And at the end of the day, they use that money to finance their own pet projects that benefits their crony capitalist businesses as well as their family businesses. And as they continue to do that, majority of your citizens keep getting poorer and poorer and poorer. Because at the end of the day, the money that comes in is not used to develop your various African countries. It goes to benefit just very few people. I mean, you live in a continent, third world continent, but at the same time, you spend more on food and basic amenities than a developed country. I mean, come on, give me a break. I mean, what kind of system is that? I mean, look at your own various African countries. Look at it. Look at it. How much it costs to feed yourselves down there with all the arable land. I mean, look at it yourself, because everything that you do there now is being imported. And they will tell you that they don't have a structured system of getting revenue, tax revenue from its citizens. So everything has to be put on import duties. So they tax you. Everything you do down there, you are being taxed. And you are one of the most highest taxed people on this planet. It's sad, but that's the reality, fellows. I mean, so you already heard from a president telling you guys exactly what is going on and what happens. So, fellows, I'm going to end here and say this. If it's Sunday, it's the Africa Weekly Talk. God bless you guys and have a great week. Thank you and peace and love.